Topic 10. The End of Salutary Neglect and the Beginning of the Idea of a United States of America, 1763 through 65. You should take notes during this podcast, pause as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, students will be able to explain the reasons motivating Britain to end its policy of salutary neglect in 1763, identify some of the actions Britain took to reestablish mercantilism and imperial control over its North American colonies, 1763 through 5, identify and explain colonial reactions to the Stamp Act, and connect imperial policy, 1763 through 5, and colonial reactions to it, to the American Revolution, 1775 through 83, and the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. Like other imperial European powers, Britain's economic system of mercantilism intended to enrich itself through extracting as many natural resources from its global colonies as possible. These resources, such as timber from New England, would be manufactured in England itself and sold throughout Europe and even back to the colonies in finished form. Theoretically, taxes placed on these commodities would flow to the British Crown. However, from 1650 to the end of the French and Indian War, 1763, Britain did not strongly enforce mercantilist policy. For example, taxes went uncollected, and Americans shipped their raw materials on any number of countries' vessels, in spite of the Navigation Act's prohibition of this action. This rough century-long period of lax enforcement of the Navigation Acts and other mercantilist policy has come to be known as salutary neglect. The Latin root of salutary is healthful. This period was healthful or beneficial to the colony's economy because it allowed American businesses to thrive without excessive regulation or taxation. Salutary neglect ended following Britain's war against France, placing new burdens on the colonies and thus forever changing its relationship with them. While England and France had fought a number of colonies since 1689, the French and Indian War was unique. Unlike previous wars between the two European superpowers of the 18th century, this war erupted in the colonies and spread back to Europe, signaling the increased importance of the colonies to imperial power. This is also why the other name for the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 63 in the New World, is known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, where it began only in 1756. While Britain emerged victorious in the conflict, that victory came at a high cost. George Grenville, the British Prime Minister appointed in 1763, decided that American colonies would have to contribute their fair share to repay Britain for its cost of fighting the war. In Britain's eyes, England had undertaken debt since 1754 to protect the colonies from French aggression. In 1763, it reasoned it was time to pay the piper. Before we examine the taxes passed by Britain in 1764 and 5, let us analyze another way that Britain attempted to exert control over its colonies in 1763. As the name of the war implies, the French and Indian War was fought by French and Indians as well as the British. Both European powers allied with different Indian tribes during the conflict. Britain received the land west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi, right here, in the 1763 Treaty of Paris that ended the war. The Indians who already lived there worried that Americans, who had already begun migrating over the mountains, would continue to encroach upon their lands. Though Britain held nominal control over this territory, it did not possess the political will or financial means to impose military control over it. Seeking to avert a conflict between American migrants and Indians after its costly war with France, Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, seen in this red line running north-south, which forbade American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Americans, however, viewed the proclamation of 1763 through different eyes. Many could not understand why it seemed that Native Americans' needs were given precedence over their own for cheap land. Moreover, since colonists had already begun settling in the contested area, they argued that it was Britain's responsibility to protect them, subjects of the British Crown, from Indian attacks. Unfortunately, the Proclamation of 1763 would hardly be the last event that colonists viewed entirely differently from Britain's. Though a couple of taxes were passed in 1764, neither the Sugar nor the Currency Act was greeted with the level of vitriol that the Stamp Act of 1765 engendered. Placing a tax on all paper goods, the Stamp Act cut into the profit of two vocal professions: newspaper editors and lawyers. Opponents to the tax adopted the refrain well known by school children today: no taxation without representation. In actuality, this motto was slightly disingenuous. The Sons of Liberty and other Stamp Act opponents knew that the American colonies were virtually represented in Parliament, the legislative body in England that levied this and all taxes. Under the doctrine of virtual representation, Parliament claimed that all MPs, or members of Parliament, represented all subjects of the Crown, including American colonists. However, Stamp Act opponents rejected this notion of representation because they had not voted for any MP. Instead, Stamp Act opponents desired actual representation, where Americans, or at least white property-owning male Americans, could send their own democratically elected representative to Parliament to serve their interests. Parliament and the King squarely rejected the prospect of actual representation, so Stamp Act opponents felt justified in claiming that the tax had been placed upon them by legislatures an ocean away who were blind and deaf to their interests. Opposition to the Stamp Act took a variety of forms. On the more peaceful end of the spectrum, newspaper editors published pieces condemning the act, and citizens groups boycotted or refused to buy goods that required the taxed stamp. This protest method of non-consumption would also be applied, often by groups of women, to other groups, such as Britain textiles. Patriot women, those who adhered to the cause of American freedom, proudly spun their own cloth, which became known as homespun, rather than purchase British taxed textiles. The Sons of Liberty was a radical group formed by Bostonian Sam Adams in opposition to the Stamp Act. Radical opponents to this and future taxes sometimes embraced violent methods of protest, including tarring and feathering of tax collectors, burning effigies of royal officials, and burning the house of Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson to the ground. Though the Stamp Act was eventually repealed by Parliament in 1766, the strong feelings that it incited on both sides of the pond allow us a glimpse into why the Americans eventually sought to break away from England. A single event, the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, was viewed through entirely different lenses in England and in America. Those who lived in the former thought it was a necessary and justifiable way to replenish the treasury that Britain had depleted while fighting the French and Indian War, a conflict that Britain saw as benefiting mostly American colonies. On the other hand, the colonists viewed the tax as undemocratic because Parliament, the body that had imposed the tax, allowed no American representatives into its ranks. Moreover, colonists, perhaps spoiled by more than a century of salutary neglect, during which Britain only inconsistently collected the taxes that formed part of its mercantilist economic system, bristled at the notion of a tax that would impede their future economic success. One event, two very different views of that event. The underlying inability of both sides to see the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and future events from the other's perspective would lead ultimately to war, a declaration of independence, and the establishment of a new nation, the United States of America.